Thank you, Yves. So now we'll be talking about the main method, which pieces all the other methods that help us into one method. And here we'll start with the declaration.
So line 14, like Joseph said, is the declaration of the array. So the array is an integer and is named nums and has 5 elements within the array. Line 16 is randomizing each element within the array using a formula which is math.random times 100. Therefore, meaning that the values of each of the elements can range from 0 to 100.
Next, we have the system.out.println line, and this will basically print out this before the results. This is a legend to show you what the symbols in the output will mean. So this will mean that there's a pivot. This will mean that a swap is happening, and this will symbolize that it is the pivot and it's also swapping.
So next is the QuickSort method, which is on line 17. So the parameters within the QuickSort method are nums, which is the array, 0, which is the left side, and nums.length minus 1, which is the right side.
Next, we have the print method, which will print out the output. We will utilize a few arguments, which is nums, which is the array, nums.length, the left value, nums.length again, which is the right value, and nums.length, which is the pivot.
So the pivot is a value determined by 2 indexes, the starting index and the ending index. The pivot will be in the middle of the 2 indexes, and this is determined by a formula which is a plus b divided by 2. The value is always typecasted, therefore in the case that it is a double, it will be truncated.
So if we actually go down to the print method right here, we will see that it is all under a big for loop. So whenever the for loop runs, each time it's printing out a value within the array. But there are always different scenarios for the values, so we'll just talk about the different conditions we have. So this condition here ultimately determines that if it's not a pivot, well, basically if it's a left value or if it's a right value that are being swapped, and if it's lower than 10, and if it's the pivot, we'll put 0 because the single value has to be at a 0, because if you just print out a single value, it'll be unorganized. So if it's equal to the pivot, we put the symbol that contains the pivot and is being swapped, like we said earlier, plus the 0. But if it's not a pivot, we put this, which means it's just being swapped. We can know that this is just being swapped because it's under this condition. And then we have the actual conditions that are for numbers over than 10, so this condition is not present. So if it's over than 10, it'll do the same thing with the same symbols, except we don't add a 0 because there's already 2 digits. And then after that, so it's now saying that if this is not true, so basically if it's a pivot or a number that's not sorted or it's just being printed without a symbol, and we'll have the 2 sections, which is less than 10 and greater than 10. So if it's basically equal to the pivot, we'll have the pivot symbol plus the 0, because this will mean that it's a single digit number because it's smaller than 10. And the other one, if it's equal to the pivot, it'll have the pivot symbol. If it's not, it'll have nothing because the number had no specific function. And that's it for the print method.